I never thought a 17-foot fishing boat would turn my life into a 3-ring circus. But that's exactly what happened the day Deborah Zimmerman spotted it parked in my driveway in Clearwater, Florida. It was a Tuesday morning in March when I pulled my boat home from the marina for some maintenance work. The hull needed a good cleaning, the engine required an oil change, and I wanted to replace a few worn fishing rod holders before the summer season kicked in. I'd owned the modest center console for 5 years, using it most weekends to fish the Gulf waters, and it had never caused me a single problem until now. I was halfway through scrubbing barnacles off the hull when Deborah's white Lexus SUV rolled up my street like a shark circling prey. She parked directly in front of my house, got out wearing her signature white Caprice and floral blouse, and marched across my lawn without hesitation. Her blonde hair was styled in that particular cut that screamed, "I demand to speak to your manager," and her oversized sunglasses couldn't hide the look of disgust on her face. "Excuse me," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" I stood up from where I'd been working, setting down my scrub brush. "Working on my boat. Can I help you with something?" "That," she said, pointing at my boat like it was a crime scene, "is a violation of our HOA regulations. You cannot park boats in driveways or on streets in this neighborhood. It's been clearly stated in multiple newsletters." I wiped my hands on a rag, taking a moment to process this interaction. I'm Wade Ellis, and I'd lived in the Sunset Palms community for 8 years. I'd served on various committees, paid my dues on time, and never caused any problems. I knew the HOA rules pretty well, or at least I thought I did. "Actually, I checked the covenants before I bought the boat," I said calmly. "There's nothing prohibiting boats in driveways for up to 72 hours for maintenance purposes." Deborah's face turned an impressive shade of red. "That's absolutely incorrect. I'm the HOA president, and I'm telling you right now that this is a violation." "I have the documents inside if you'd like to review them together," I offered, trying to keep things civil. "I don't need to review anything. I know the rules." "You have until 5 o'clock today to remove that eyesore, or you'll be fined $500 per day until compliance is achieved." She spun on her heel and marched back to her Lexus before I could respond. I watched her drive away, feeling my blood pressure rising. I wasn't someone who enjoyed conflict, but I also wasn't going to be bullied when I knew I was in the right. I went inside and pulled out my copy of the HOA covenants and restrictions. Sure enough, Section 8, Paragraph 3 clearly stated, "Recreational vehicles, boats, and trailers may be parked in resident driveways for maintenance purposes not to exceed 72 consecutive hours. Boats must be on trailers and not create hazardous conditions or obstruct neighboring properties." My boat was on its trailer, parked entirely on my property, and wasn't blocking anything. I took photos of the relevant sections and emailed them to the HOA board email address with a polite explanation of my position. I figured that would be the end of it. I was wrong. The next morning, I found a bright orange violation notice zip-tied to my mailbox. It stated that I was in violation of Section 12, Paragraph 7 regarding unsightly vessels, and that I had 24 hours to comply or face fines starting at $500 per day. I looked up Section 12, Paragraph 7 in my documents. It dealt with holiday decorations and had absolutely nothing to do with boats. I called the HOA management company, Coastal Property Management, and got a receptionist named Jennifer who sounded sympathetic but ultimately unhelpful. "I understand your frustration, Mr. Ellis," she said. "But if the board president has issued a violation notice, there's a process you need to follow. You can file a formal dispute and request a hearing before the board." "How long does that take?" usually about 30 days. And the fines continue accumulating during that time. Yes, but if you win your dispute, they'll be reversed. And if the board just decides I'm wrong anyway, Jennifer sighed, then you can take it to arbitration or court, but that's obviously a longer and more expensive process. I thanked her for her time and hung up, feeling the system working against me. I finished my boat maintenance that day and towed it back to the marina that evening, not because I thought I was wrong, but because I couldn't afford to rack up thousands in fines while fighting the dispute. But I filed the formal dispute anyway. I wasn't going to let Deborah Zimmerman bully me or distort the HOA rules to suit her preferences. I submitted a detailed written explanation along with highlighted copies of the relevant covenant sections and requested a hearing before the full board. 3 weeks later, I received notice that my hearing was scheduled for the first Thursday in April. The meeting would take place at the Clearwater Community Center at 7 in the evening. I prepared my materials carefully, printing multiple copies of the relevant sections, photos showing my boat was properly stored on my property, and even a brief legal opinion. I'd paid a real estate attorney $200 to write confirming my interpretation of the rules. The night of the hearing arrived with typical Florida humidity. I showed up 15 minutes early and found the community center conference room already occupied by the 5-member HOA board. Deborah sat at the center of the table, flanked by 2 other women and 2 men I recognized from neighborhood events but didn't know well. "Mr. Ellis," Deborah said without warmth, "please sit." I took the lone chair facing the board, feeling like I was on trial. About a dozen other residents had filed into the room to watch, which surprised me. Word had apparently gotten around about this dispute. "We've reviewed your appeal," Deborah continued, "and we'd like to hear your statement." I went through my presentation methodically, showing them the covenant sections, explaining how my boat complied with every requirement, and noting that the violation notice had cited an irrelevant section about holiday decorations. The 2 board members I didn't know seemed to be paying attention, occasionally nodding or taking notes. When I finished, Deborah didn't even pause. "Thank you for your statement. However, the board maintains that your boat constitutes a nuisance and violates the spirit of our community standards. The covenant section you're citing is outdated and has been superseded by later amendments." "What amendments?" I asked. "I have the most recent version from the county records, dated 2019. There's been nothing filed since then." One of the men on the board, a guy named Richard, spoke up. "Actually, Deborah, I don't recall any amendments about boats. When were those passed?" Deborah shot him a look that could freeze water. "They were discussed extensively in 2021. You should review your minutes." "I was on the board in 2021, Richard said, frowning. "We never voted on any amendments regarding boats." "Perhaps you were absent that meeting," Deborah snapped. "I only missed 1 meeting that year due to surgery," Richard said, "and we don't have the authority to pass amendments without a community-wide vote anyway. Amendments require approval from 67% of homeowners." The room had gotten very quiet. I could see Deborah's jaw clenching. "Regardless," she said, her voice tight, "the board has the authority to interpret rules and maintain community standards. I move that we uphold the violation." "I'd like to see the specific amendment first," Richard said, "before we vote on anything." "I second that," said one of the women on the board, a petite woman with gray hair named Margaret. Deborah looked like she wanted to throw something. "This is highly irregular. Fine. We'll table this matter until next month's meeting so the appropriate documentation can be provided." Meeting adjourned. She gathered her papers and stormed out before anyone could say anything else. I approached Richard and Margaret after the meeting broke up. "Thank you for that," I said. Richard shook his head. Something's not right here. I've been on this board for 6 years, and I know for a fact we never passed any boat amendments. Deborah has been getting increasingly aggressive about enforcing rules, sometimes rules that don't actually exist. Why does she care so much about my boat? I asked. Margaret laughed dryly. Deborah cares about control. She wants this neighborhood to look like a magazine spread, and anything that doesn't fit her vision is automatically wrong in her mind. Last year she tried to fine the Johnsons for painting their house the wrong shade of beige, even though it was on the approved color list. What should I do? I asked. Keep documenting everything, Richard advised. And you might want to start coming to board meetings. They're the second Thursday of every month. I have a feeling this isn't over. He was right. Over the next 2 weeks, I started receiving anonymous letters in my mailbox. They weren't signed, but the message was clear. I wasn't welcome in the neighborhood if I couldn't follow the rules. One letter called me a trashy boat person ruining property values. Another suggested I move to a trailer park where I belonged. I had a pretty good idea who was behind them, but I couldn't prove it. I kept every letter in a folder and took photos of each one as evidence. Meanwhile, I did some digging into Deborah's background as HOA president. It turned out she'd taken over the position 3 years ago after running unopposed. Her predecessor had been a retired accountant who ran things quietly and fairly. Since taking office, Deborah had tripled the amount of violation notices issued, increased the annual HOA dues twice, and hired her brother-in-law's company to handle landscaping at a premium rate. I also discovered something interesting while reviewing old board minutes available on the community website. 5 years ago, the HOA had purchased a 3-acre lot on the outskirts of our development for $12,000. The lot had been intended as a future community garden or recreation area, but nothing had ever been built there. Instead, according to aerial photos I found online, it was being used as an informal storage area. I could see boats, RVs, and trailers parked there in neat rows. This struck me as odd, so I drove over to check it out in person. The lot was surrounded by a chain-link fence with a coded gate. I watched for about 20 minutes and saw 3 different residents come and go, punching in a code to access their stored vehicles. The lot was maybe half a mile from the main neighborhood, hidden behind a stand of palm trees along a dead-end service road. I took photos and started asking around discreetly. My neighbor, Tom, who lived 2 doors down, told me he'd been parking his RV there for 2 years. The HOA rents out spaces, he said. $50 a month. It's cheaper than commercial storage and it keeps the neighborhood looking clean. Didn't you get the email about it? No, I said. I never heard anything about HOA storage. That's weird. They sent it out a while back. You should ask Deborah about it. She manages the whole thing. A light bulb went off in my head. I went home and started pulling county property records. It took some navigating through the clerk's website, but I eventually found what I was looking for. The 3-acre lot in question had indeed been purchased by the Sunset Palms HOA 5 years ago. But there was something else interesting in the records. 2 years ago, there had been a quitclaim deed transferring the property from the HOA to a private owner. The new owner was listed as Coastal Holdings LLC. I dug deeper and found the LLC registration with the state. It had been formed 2.5 years ago, and the registered agent was Deborah's husband, Frank Zimmerman. My heart started racing. If I was understanding this correctly, Deborah had somehow transferred HOA property into her personal control and was profiting from it by charging residents for storage. That couldn't be legal. I called the real estate attorney I'd consulted before, a woman named Patricia Chen, and explained what I'd found. That's embezzlement and fraud, she said bluntly. If she transferred HOA property without proper authorization and is personally profiting from it, that's a serious crime. You need to document everything and probably report this to law enforcement. What about the HOA? Should I tell the board? You could, but if the president is the one committing fraud, you might not get a fair hearing. My advice would be to get the authorities involved first, then bring it to the board with evidence. Do you have copies of all these property records? Yes, I've downloaded everything from the county website. Good, keep multiple copies. And consider getting a forensic accountant to review the HOA's financial statements if they are available to homeowners. I thanked her and hung up, feeling like I'd stumbled into something much bigger than a dispute about my boat. This wasn't just about Deborah being controlling anymore. This was actual criminal activity. I spent the next week gathering evidence. I obtained copies of all property records, LLC filings, and old board minutes. I also requested financial statements from the HOA management company, which they were legally required to provide to homeowners. When the statements arrived, I took them to a forensic accountant Patricia recommended. His name was Stuart Lynn, and his office was in a strip mall near Tampa. He was a thin man in his 50s with wire-rimmed glasses and the focused intensity of someone who genuinely loved numbers. "This is interesting," he said after reviewing the documents for about an hour. "Look here. 5 years ago, the HOA purchased the lot for $12,000, funded by a special assessment to all homeowners. Do you remember paying that?" "I think so," I said. "It was my first year living there. They said it was for community improvements." "Right, now look at the financials from 2 years ago. There's a line item here, land sale proceeds, $15,000. That money went into the general HOA fund, and then over the next few months, it was gradually moved into various expense categories. Landscaping, repairs, administrative costs. But those expenses seem inflated compared to previous years. So she sold the land to herself, deposited the money, and then siphoned it back out through fake expenses. That's what it looks like. And now she's collecting rent from homeowners who think they're paying the HOA, but the money is actually going to her private company. If she has 20 spaces rented at $50 per month, that's $12,000 a year in pure profit from property that never should have been sold in the first place. How much total are we talking about? Stuart did some calculations. Over the past 2 years, between the original sale proceeds and the rental income, probably close to $40,000. That's felony embezzlement territory in Florida. I felt sick to my stomach. This woman had been stealing from the community while simultaneously harassing people about boats and paint colors. "What do I do with this information?" I asked. "Report it to the police," Stuart said. "This is beyond civil disputes now. This is criminal fraud." I left Stuart's office with a detailed report and drove straight to the Clearwater Police Department. I asked to speak with someone about financial fraud, and after a short wait, I was directed to a detective named Maria Santos. Detective Santos was in her early 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. I laid out everything I'd discovered: the property transfer, the LLC ownership, the rental income, the missing HOA funds. She listened carefully, taking notes and occasionally asking clarifying questions. "This is solid work," she said when I finished. "You've basically done half the investigation for us. I'm going to need to keep copies of all these documents. We'll also need to talk to the HOA management company and probably the other board members. This could take a while." "How long?" "Depends on how cooperative everyone is. Financial investigations can be slow. But based on what you've shown me, I think we have probable cause to at least start looking into this seriously." What about the storage lot? People are still paying rent to her. Keep documentation of that too. In fact, if you can safely get photos or videos of people accessing the lot and any rental agreements they might have, that would help. But don't do anything that puts you at risk or violates anyone's privacy. I thanked her and left, feeling like I'd at least started the ball rolling. But I still had my own immediate problem. The next board meeting was in 3 days, and Deborah was supposed to provide evidence of the boat amendments she'd claimed existed. The meeting arrived on a humid Thursday evening. I got to the community center early again and found the room more crowded than last time. Word had really spread now, and at least 30 residents packed the small conference room. I noticed Tom there, along with several other people I'd seen at the storage lot. Deborah called the meeting to order with visible irritation. She rushed through normal business, financial reports that I now knew were fraudulent, committee updates, and then reached the agenda item about my violation dispute. As you'll recall, she said tersely, Mr. Ellis has appealed his violation for parking a boat in his driveway. I was asked to provide documentation of amendments restricting such activity. After thorough review of our records, I've determined that the amendments in question were discussed, but not formally voted upon due to administrative oversight. However, the board retains interpretive authority over community standards, and it remains our position that boats visible from the street violate those standards. That's not an answer, Richard said. You claimed amendments existed. Either they do or they don't. I've explained the situation, Deborah snapped. No, Margaret spoke up. You've admitted that no amendments exist, which means Mr. Ellis was right from the beginning. His boat was parked legally according to our actual covenants. The violation should be dismissed. I move to dismiss the violation and issue a formal apology to Mr. Ellis, Richard said. I second that motion, Margaret added. Deborah's face was turning purple. This is premature. We need more discussion. Call the vote, Richard insisted. Deborah looked at the other board members. The two who hadn't spoken yet, a woman named Linda and a man named Jeff, looked uncomfortable but nodded. All in favor of dismissing the violation? Richard asked. 4 hands went up. Richard, Margaret, Linda, and Jeff. Only Deborah abstained. Motion carries, Richard said. The violation is dismissed. Deborah gathered her papers violently, shoving them into her bag. This meeting is adjourned. Actually, I said, standing up, I have something to add to new business. Deborah glared at me. The meeting is adjourned. She can't adjourn without a vote, Richard said. Mr. Ellis has the floor. I pulled out copies of the documents I'd prepared, the property records, LLC filings, and financial analysis. I'd made enough copies for all board members and several residents. I've discovered that the storage lot our community uses is no longer owned by the HOA, I said, distributing the papers. 2 years ago, it was transferred to a private LLC owned by the Zimmerman family. Residents have been paying rent thinking it goes to the HOA, but it actually goes directly to a private company. Additionally, the HOA never received fair market value for the property when it was transferred, and homeowners were never consulted or voted on the sale. The room erupted in noise. People were talking over each other, some angry, some confused. I saw Tom holding his copy of the documents with his mouth hanging open. "This is outrageous," someone shouted. "I've been paying rent for 2 years. That's my money." Another person yelled. Deborah had gone completely white. "This is slander. You have no idea what you're talking about." "It's all in the county records," I said calmly. "Anyone can verify it. I've also reported this to the Clearwater Police Department Fraud Division, and they've opened an investigation." "You what?" Deborah shrieked. "You stole from the community," I said. That's a crime. Richard was speed reading through the documents, his face getting darker. Deborah, is this true? Did you transfer HOA property to your personal company? This is a gross mischaracterization, Deborah stammered. The HOA was facing budget shortfalls. Selling the property was necessary to maintain operations, and the LLC was formed to manage the storage facility more efficiently. Any rental income was always intended to benefit the community. Then, why does none of it show up in our financial statements? Margaret asked, also reading through the papers. It does. It's categorized under miscellaneous income. Show me where, Richard demanded. Deborah couldn't. The room had descended into chaos with residents shouting questions and accusations. Jeff called for an emergency executive session to review the documents, and Richard immediately agreed. The board members retreated to a back office while the rest of us waited in tense silence. They were gone for almost 45 minutes. When they returned, Richard looked grim. Based on preliminary review, he announced, the board has voted 4-1 to immediately suspend Deborah Zimmerman as HOA president, pending a full investigation. We're also voting to retain independent legal counsel to review all financial transactions from the past 3 years. Additionally, we're cooperating fully with law enforcement. Deborah stood up so fast her chair fell over. You can't do this. I'll sue every one of you. You can try, Richard said. But I'd suggest you get a good lawyer. You're going to need one. Deborah stormed out, slamming the door behind her. The room broke into applause, and I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. This wasn't over, but at least the truth was out. Over the next few weeks, things moved quickly. Detective Santos executed a search warrant on Deborah's home and seized financial records, computers, and documents related to Coastal Holdings LLC. The HOA hired a law firm specializing in community association disputes, and they began a comprehensive audit of all finances. The audit revealed that Deborah's embezzlement was even more extensive than I'd initially discovered. Beyond the storage lot fraud, she'd been approving inflated contracts to her brother-in-law's landscaping company and pocketing kickbacks. She'd also been charging personal expenses to HOA credit cards, including vacations, restaurants, and shopping trips. All told, the forensic accountants estimated she'd stolen over $70,000 from the community over 3 years. The state attorney's office filed criminal charges in early May: grand theft, organized fraud, and official misconduct. Deborah was arrested at her home on a Tuesday morning, and local news cameras captured her being led out in handcuffs. The story made local headlines. HOA president arrested for embezzling from community. I watched the news coverage from my living room, feeling a strange mixture of satisfaction and sadness. I hadn't wanted any of this. I just wanted to work on my boat in peace. But Deborah's obsessive need for control and her criminal greed had set all of this in motion. The criminal case moved through the system over the following months. Deborah initially pleaded not guilty, but as the evidence mounted, her attorney convinced her to negotiate. In August, she pleaded no contest to reduce charges in exchange for a sentence recommendation of 5 years probation, full restitution of $70,000 plus interest and penalties, and 500 hours of community service. She was also permanently banned from serving on any HOA board in Florida. The judge accepted the plea deal but added his own conditions. Deborah would be required to make monthly restitution payments of $1,000, and if she missed a single payment, she'd serve 18 months in county jail. She would also be required to speak at community association conferences about ethics and fiduciary responsibility as part of her community service. The civil side was messier. The HOA sued Deborah and Frank Zimmerman to recover the storage lot property. Frank claimed he had no knowledge of his wife's fraud, but the evidence showed he'd signed documents as the LLC's registered agent and had deposited rental checks. The court wasn't sympathetic. In October, a judge ordered the immediate transfer of the property back to the HOA and required the Zimmermans to pay an additional $25,000 in damages and legal fees. To satisfy the judgment, they were forced to sell their home in Sunset Palms and move out of the community. As for the storage lot, the HOA board voted to continue operating it, but with proper oversight and transparent accounting. They reduced the rental fee to $30 per month to just cover maintenance costs, with any excess going into a reserve fund. They also voted to allow residents to store boats, RVs, and trailers there for up to 1 week per month at no charge for basic maintenance. Richard was elected as the new HOA president in a special election held in September. One of his first acts was to formally apologize to me at a board meeting for the harassment I'd endured, and to present me with a plaque thanking me for extraordinary service to the community in exposing fraud and upholding integrity. It was a nice gesture, though I felt awkward about the attention. More importantly, Richard and the new board implemented sweeping reforms. They established financial controls requiring dual signatures on all checks over $500. They created an independent audit committee of homeowners who weren't board members to review finances quarterly. They also updated the community website to include detailed financial reports, meeting minutes, and all governing documents, so every homeowner had easy access to information. The changes extended to enforcement policies, too. The board created a formal review process for all violations, requiring photographic evidence, specific covenant citations, and an opportunity for homeowners to respond before any fines were issued. They also limited the president's unilateral authority, requiring board votes for any fine over $250. Life in Sunset Palms slowly returned to normal, though the community had changed. People were more engaged now, actually attending board meetings and paying attention to how their dues were spent. Several residents who'd been intimidated by Deborah's aggressive enforcement tactics felt empowered to push back against unfair treatment. Tom, my neighbor, told me about how Deborah had fined him repeatedly for having his trash cans visible from the street, even though he always brought them in within hours of pickup, as the rules required. Another neighbor, Susan, had been cited multiple times for her mailbox not meeting aesthetic standards, though it was identical to dozens of others in the neighborhood. Once Deborah was gone, those petty violations evaporated. As for me, I kept my boat at the marina most of the time, but I brought it home for maintenance whenever I needed to. Nobody ever complained again. I also started storing it at the HOA lot during hurricane season, taking advantage of the free weekly storage that the new board had implemented. In December, almost 9 months after this whole thing started, I received a check in the mail from the HOA for $375. It represented my share of the restitution money that had been recovered and distributed proportionally to all homeowners based on how long they'd lived in the community during Deborah's tenure. It wasn't much, but it felt like a final closing of the chapter. I also received a letter from Deborah's attorney around the same time. It was a formal apology, obviously written by the lawyer but signed by Deborah. It acknowledged that she'd improperly issued a violation against me, that I had been in full compliance with all HOA rules, and that her actions had caused me undue stress and expense. The letter was probably required as part of her plea deal, but I appreciated it anyway. The whole experience taught me several valuable lessons. First, documentation is everything. If I hadn't kept careful records, taken photos, and researched the actual covenant language, I never would have been able to fight back effectively. Second, transparency in community governance isn't just nice to have, it's essential for preventing abuse. Deborah had been able to steal for years because nobody was paying attention to the details. Third, sometimes standing up to bullies leads to discovering much bigger problems. I never set out to be a whistleblower or community hero. I just wanted to wash my boat and change the oil without being hassled. But Deborah's irrational hostility toward my completely legal boat parking had started a chain of events that exposed systematic fraud and ultimately made our community better and stronger. The irony wasn't lost on me that Deborah's complaint about my boat, which was explicitly allowed by HOA rules, had led to the discovery that she'd stolen and was illegally profiting from the very storage lot that was created precisely so people didn't have to park boats in their driveways. If she'd just left me alone, she probably could have continued her embezzlement for years without detection. In January, almost a full year after this began, I was working on my boat in my driveway again. It was a Saturday morning, and I was replacing the impeller in the cooling system. Richard walked by with his dog and stopped to chat. "How's the boat running?" he asked. "Pretty good. This old girl still has plenty of life in her." "You know," Richard said, "I never thanked you properly for what you did." I'd been on that board for years, and I knew something felt off about Deborah's management, but I never dug deep enough to find out what. "You saved this community a lot of money and a lot of future problems." "I was just defending myself," I said. "That's how it starts. One person standing up for what's right. Anyway, I wanted you to know that the board voted to name the storage lot after you. We're putting up a sign next week, Wade Ellis Community Storage Facility." I nearly dropped my wrench. "You don't need to do that. We already voted. It's done." Plus, Margaret insisted. "You know how she is." I laughed. Margaret had become a good friend over the past year. She'd been fighting Deborah's overreach for longer than anyone and had been thrilled when the whole thing came crashing down. "Well, tell everyone I appreciate it," I said. Richard nodded and continued his walk. I went back to working on my boat, feeling genuinely content. The sun was shining, the Gulf breeze was blowing, and I was exactly where I wanted to be, doing exactly what I wanted to do, without anyone telling me I couldn't. That evening, I took the boat out for a sunset cruise. The water was calm, the sky was painted in oranges and purples, and I caught a nice redfish that I released after snapping a quick photo. As I headed back to the marina, I thought about how a single complaint from a controlling HOA president had somehow led to all of this. If Deborah had just accepted that my boat was legally parked according to the actual written rules, none of the rest would have happened. She'd still be HOA president, still embezzling money, still bullying residents with fake violations and made-up rules. My boat would have been stored at the lot she was illegally profiting from, generating $50 a month in her pocket. Instead, her need to enforce her personal vision of what the neighborhood should look like, regardless of what the rules actually said, had been her downfall. She'd picked a fight with someone who was willing to read the fine print, follow the evidence, and push back against injustice. The legal proceedings finally concluded in March, exactly 1 year after Deborah had first marched across my lawn to complain about my boat. Her last appeal was denied, her restitution payment plan was locked in, and the property transfer back to the HOA was finalized. The Zimmermans had moved to somewhere in Georgia, and I heard through the neighborhood gossip chain that they were getting divorced. I didn't take any pleasure in Deborah's personal misfortune. What she'd done was wrong, and she'd faced appropriate consequences, but I'd never wanted to destroy her life. I just wanted to be left alone to live within the rules we'd all agreed to follow. The new sign went up at the storage lot in April. It was a nice wooden sign with carved letters. Wade Ellis Community Storage Facility established 2019, restored 2024. Below that, in smaller letters, transparency, integrity, community. Richard invited me to a small ribbon-cutting ceremony, which felt excessive but was actually kind of nice. About 50 residents showed up, and several people thanked me personally for exposing the fraud. One older gentleman, a retired Marine named Harold, pulled me aside after the ceremony. "You did good, son," he said. "I've lived in 7 different HOA communities over my life, and they all struggle with the same problem. People get a little power and think it makes them special. You reminded everyone that rules exist to serve the community, not the other way around. That's important." His words stuck with me. Harold was right. HOAs serve a legitimate purpose when they're run properly. They maintain common areas, enforce reasonable standards that protect property values, and provide amenities that individual homeowners couldn't afford alone. But they can also become petty fiefdoms for people who confuse authority with wisdom. Over that year, I'd learned more about HOA law and community governance than I ever wanted to know. I'd sat through dozens of board meetings, reviewed hundreds of pages of financial documents, and spent countless hours on the phone with lawyers, accountants, and law enforcement. It had been exhausting and stressful, but ultimately worth it. My legal expenses, which had totaled about $3,000 between attorney consultations and the forensic accountant, were eventually reimbursed by the HOA as part of a board vote recognizing that I'd been acting in the community's interest. That helped, though it didn't cover the time and stress. The following summer brought a sense of normalcy I hadn't felt since before all this started. I used my boat regularly, storing it at the community lot during the week and bringing it home for maintenance as needed. Nobody complained. Nobody sent violation notices. It was exactly how things should have worked from the beginning. I even joined the HOA board myself, elected to a 2-year term in the annual election that June. I figured after everything I'd been through, I might as well help ensure the reforms Richard had implemented stayed in place. My fellow board members were good people committed to transparent, fair governance. We weren't perfect, but we tried to apply rules consistently and give homeowners the benefit of the doubt. One case that came before us during my first months on the board involved a resident who'd painted her front door a bright turquoise blue. Several neighbors complained it was too bold and didn't fit the neighborhood aesthetic. The covenants specified that exterior paint colors had to be earth tones or subdued shades, which was admittedly vague. Instead of immediately issuing a violation like Deborah would have done, we invited the homeowner to a meeting to discuss it. She explained that the turquoise door was a tradition in her family, representing welcome and hospitality. She'd painted every front door of every house she'd lived in the same color for 30 years. We looked at photos and considered whether it really harmed anyone. The door was tasteful, well-maintained, and visible but not garish. After discussion, the board voted 3-2 to allow it, determining that turquoise could reasonably be considered a subdued shade, and that homeowners should have some personal expression in their properties. That decision would have been unthinkable under Deborah's reign. She would have seen any deviation from her personal taste as an unacceptable violation requiring immediate enforcement. But rules should serve people, not control them. That became our guiding principle. The storage lot flourished under community ownership. Tom and several other residents organized workdays to improve the facility. They added better lighting, repaired the fence, painted clear parking lines, and even planted some landscaping along the perimeter. It became a point of pride rather than a profit center. Usage fees were kept minimal, just enough to cover insurance, maintenance, and utilities for the lighting. The board voted to waive fees entirely for any resident who couldn't afford them, funded by a small line item in the annual budget. The lot wasn't about making money. It was about serving homeowners. I also developed an unexpected friendship with Detective Santos from the police department. She called me several months after Deborah's conviction to let me know that my case had inspired the department to create an educational program about HOA fraud for community association managers. They wanted to help people recognize warning signs before embezzlement got out of control. "You did something important," Detective Santos told me. "Most HOA fraud goes unreported because homeowners don't know what to look for or they're afraid of retaliation. Your willingness to push back and document everything made this case solid. We want to teach other people to do the same thing." They asked if I'd be willing to speak at one of their training sessions, sharing my experience from a homeowner's perspective. I agreed, and ended up presenting to about 40 HOA board members and property managers at a conference in Tampa that fall. It was nerve-wracking standing up in front of that many people, but the response was positive. Several attendees told me afterward that they were going to implement better financial controls in their own communities. One woman, an HOA president from St. Petersburg, said my story had prompted her to request an independent audit of her community's finances. That audit uncovered irregularities in their management company's billing, resulting in a $40,000 refund to the HOA. She thanked me with tears in her eyes, saying that money would fund playground equipment for the community that they'd been told they couldn't afford. These ripple effects reminded me that standing up for what's right often has consequences beyond what we can immediately see. My fight over a boat had exposed fraud in my community, but it had also sparked broader awareness and reform across the region. That felt meaningful. By the second anniversary of the original incident, life had genuinely returned to normal. Deborah was nearly done with her community service hours and had been making her restitution payments consistently. I heard she was working as a receptionist at a dental office in Georgia, a far cry from wielding authority over an HOA. Frank had apparently moved on, remarried, and wanted nothing to do with Florida or community associations. I still lived in Sunset Palms, still owned my boat, and still enjoyed weekend fishing trips in the Gulf. The community was thriving under honest, transparent leadership. Property values had actually increased slightly, driven not by draconian rule enforcement, but by genuine improvements and a reputation as a well-managed neighborhood. Richard served another term as president before stepping down to travel with his wife. Margaret took over after him, bringing the same common-sense approach to governance. I stayed on the board for 4 years total before deciding I'd done my part and wanted to focus more on my actual life rather than community politics. The storage lot, still bearing my name on that wooden sign, continued to serve residents well. It had expanded slightly, with the HOA purchasing an adjacent half-acre lot to accommodate growing demand. The facility now included covered storage for boats, which protected them from the harsh Florida sun and reduced maintenance costs for owners. Looking back on the whole experience, I'm struck by how such a small thing sparked such significant change. A 17-foot fishing boat, parked legally in my driveway for routine maintenance, became the catalyst for exposing corruption, reforming governance, and ultimately strengthening an entire community. Deborah had seen my boat as a threat to her vision of suburban perfection. In reality, the only threat was to her illegal scheme and her abuse of authority. If she'd respected the actual rules instead of trying to enforce imaginary ones, she'd have avoided criminal charges, bankruptcy, divorce, and public humiliation. I learned that HOA covenants exist for a reason. They're legal contracts that all homeowners agree to when purchasing property. But they're also limited documents. They don't grant unlimited authority to boards or presidents to impose personal preferences. They require interpretation and application consistent with their actual language, not the whims of whoever happens to be in charge. I also learned the importance of community engagement. For years, most residents in Sunset Palms paid their dues and ignored HOA business. That apathy allowed Deborah to consolidate power and abuse it without oversight. Once people started paying attention, attending meetings and asking questions, the abuse couldn't continue. Today, Sunset Palms has robust participation in HOA governance. Board meetings regularly draw 30 to 40 attendees. The annual budget meeting requires a larger venue because so many people want to review financial plans and ask questions. This engagement keeps leaders honest and ensures that decisions reflect the community's actual interests rather than individual agendas. My boat still sits in my driveway occasionally, usually for a day or two when I'm doing maintenance. Neighbors wave as they walk by. Sometimes they stop to chat about fishing, asking where I've had luck lately or what lures I recommend. Nobody complains. Nobody threatens fines. It's just normal life. The whole saga taught me that standing up for yourself matters, even when it seems easier to back down. If I'd simply paid those fines and kept my mouth shut, Deborah would still be stealing from the community. Other residents would still be suffering under her arbitrary, made-up rules. The storage lot would still be enriching her private company rather than serving homeowners. One person standing up can make a difference. One person reading the actual rules, documenting violations of proper procedure, and refusing to be bullied can expose injustice and create positive change. I didn't set out to be a community activist or whistleblower. I just wanted to work on my boat in peace. But when that simple goal was threatened by illegal conduct masquerading as rule enforcement, I had a choice: accept the injustice or fight back. I chose to fight back, and that choice changed everything. Not just for me, but for hundreds of families living in Sunset Palms. It changed how our community operates, how board members understand their responsibilities, and how residents engage with governance. Those changes will outlast me, creating a better environment for future homeowners who will never know my name. That's the real legacy of this story. Not that I won a dispute about a boat, but that a community learned to value transparency, accountability, and honest leadership. Deborah's downfall wasn't just about one person facing consequences for criminal behavior. It was about an entire system being reformed to prevent future abuse. I still fish most weekends when weather permits. The Gulf waters off Clearwater remain abundant with redfish, snook, and trout. I've caught countless fish from my boat, watched hundreds of sunsets from the water, and created memories that'll last a lifetime. That boat represented freedom, recreation, and connection with nature. Deborah had seen it as an eyesore, a violation of her aesthetic preferences, something to be hidden away or eliminated. She'd been so focused on controlling appearances that she'd lost sight of what actually mattered: people's rights, honest governance, and community well-being. Her obsessive need to enforce rules that didn't exist had ultimately revealed the much more serious rules she was breaking herself. In the end, the story isn't really about a boat at all. It's about authority versus accountability, rules versus rights, and one person's willingness to stand up and say, no, that's not okay. It's about reading the fine print, trusting your instincts when something feels wrong, and following the evidence wherever it leads. My boat is just a boat. But what it represented in that moment, when Deborah marched across my lawn demanding I remove it despite having every legal right to keep it there, was something much more important. It represented my autonomy, my property rights, and my refusal to be controlled by someone abusing authority they didn't actually possess. 2 years later, I can park that boat anywhere on my property without worry. The community storage facility bearing my name serves residents honestly and fairly. Deborah faces ongoing consequences for her crimes, and Sunset Palms continues to thrive under reformed, transparent governance that respects both rules and rights. That's a pretty good outcome for a dispute that started with a 17-foot fishing boat and an HOA Karen who couldn't leave well enough alone.